turnout. I'm Dick Carroll, nothing for me to know that, but I'm with Gil, and Gil is sponsoring this. Gil is Gary's Institute for Lifelong Learning, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, associated with the college, part of the continuing department, and we come up with ideas. We made this presentation free and open to the whole public. You don't need to be a Gil member at all, and some of you showed up, because we put it in the paper and everything else. So I'm glad you're totally welcome to be here. Glad you're here. If you're interested in joining Gil, though, we invite you to. It's very outrageously expensive, though. It's $20 a year. And that entitles you to anything we put on during the entire year, unless we go to some museum or something. But that's a good deal, because we have 3 sessions a year, fall, winter, and spring. And so, that's a good deal. So if you want to sign up, you can go on the Eric Carl's EDU website, or you can talk to Natia Vanderbilt out in the reception area there, and she will sign you right up. So, having said that, obviously, you know why you're here. We're going to have a presentation on the Holocaust, which is a pretty big subject, isn't it? Beth Lures has graciously agreed to give this presentation. If you don't know Beth, Beth taught at this college for 32 years before she retired. History and other stuff, right? She is passionate about the Holocaust. And I think you told me you started getting interested when you were 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
She studied it ever since. She's so involved that she knows many, or the ones that are survivors of the Holocaust. She involved her students with the Holocaust. She's visited the sites. She's had the people in. She's gone there. So she's pretty eminently capable of giving this presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Sue. I'll bet. No, Sue, you can't do it.
I cannot do it.
You sure? Well, thank you for coming. I'll get started. Holocaust. It's just one word that encompasses so much brutality, savagery, suffering, and death. The word Holocaust comes from the Greek holocauston, which means sacrifice by fire. It refers to a time in the 1930s and the 1940s where millions of European Jews were systematically persecuted and murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? Okay. We usually hear the estimate of 6 million deaths, but it could be more. Out of those 6 million, 1.5 million were children, all with names, talents, and dreams for the future. Believing they were racially superior, the Nazis also murdered gypsies, the disabled, Poles, Russians, and other Slavic peoples. Others persecuted and murdered by the Nazis were homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, socialists, and anyone who stood against them. In 1933, it was estimated that there were about 10 million Jews in Europe. Germans and those who collaborated with them killed 2 out of every 3 Jews as part of their final solution. And their solution was to kill them all. The Nazis also killed 200,000 gypsies, 200,000 plus mentally and physically disabled patients who were primarily in German institutions. They killed anyone they thought was inferior to them. To do that, they created concentration camps, extermination camps, labor camps, transit camps, ghettos, and prison camps. And the total calculated by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum comes to 42,500. I have a map here that if you want to come look, it shows where they were. I'd like to start 42,000 camps, ghettos, transit camps, extermination camps. That's the whole total. Oh, where's my, sorry, I'm not very high tech. Whoop, I'd like to start by telling you a story about a 17-year-old young man affected by the actions of the Nazis' hatred. His name was Leo Brettholtz. Leo, as you see here, he is on your left, and his friend Manfred Silberwasser is on the right. Leo Brettholtz was a wanted man. To the Nazis, he was known as a jumper. No matter how many times Leo was caught and arrested, he always found a way to escape. At a time when Nazis were rounding up Jews and murdering them, this one 17-year-old boy, Jewish boy, kept slipping right through their fingers. Leo always wanted to stay one step ahead of those who wanted him dead. It was becoming a little embarrassing for the Germans. Leo would be arrested, then asked to use the restroom, and promptly jump out the window and run. He would jump from a car as it approached a checkpoint. But Leo's most audacious escape was when he jumped from a moving train on its way to the notorious Auschwitz death camp. Leo once again had been arrested as he tried to take refuge in Switzerland, a country many believe to be neutral, but that's questionable. However, the Swiss police arrested Leo as soon as he crossed the border and then sent him back to Nazi-occupied France. He was detained there at the, finally, he went through several camps, finally ending up at the Drancy transit camp, which is just north of Paris. I have to remember to use this. Whoops. The guards at Drancy pushed him into a cattle car, one of 20 cattle cars, with 49 other men, women, and children. Then they slammed the door shut and locked it. Only a little light filtered in through the two small barred windows. There was hardly enough room to sit or squat. And in the middle of the cattle car was a bucket where people were to relieve themselves in full view of everyone else. After a short time, the bucket was full and overflowing. The Nazi plan to dehumanize the Jews had begun. The stench in the car was unbearable, but fear of knowing they would probably be killed upon arrival at Auschwitz concerned them more. When the train began to move, their fears were voiced as moans from the elderly and screams and cries from the children. Leo thought of all the things he wanted to do with his life, all the places he wanted to see. But then his thoughts turned once again to escape. Leo and Manfred, that we saw in the picture, decided that they would find a way out of that car before the train left French territory. They saw the two parallel bars across the windows, and they said, that's the only obstacle to our escape. So they started to work on them. They decided to work on the bars, hoping eventually they could bend them enough so they could slip through and jump. Many of the car's occupants shouted encouragement and suggestions, while others were afraid that if the Nazis found out that two people had escaped, that they themselves would be killed in retaliation. Leo and Manfred took off their sweaters at the suggestion of a one-legged woman on the floor of the train. And she said, run, run, courez, courez. So they took off their sweaters and soaked them in the moisture on the floor, which was human waste. And they wrapped their sweaters around the bars, and they twisted and twisted and twisted around the bars, hoping to get them to eventually move. As they twisted, all that liquid is running down their arms. They did this for 8 solid hours. After 8 hours, the rust started to fall away from the window, and the bars began to bend a little. Finally, they started to bend inward and then loosen from the window's frame. and Leo and Manfred were able to bend them just enough with their hands. When the night, they waited for darkness to provide cover for their escape, and when night came, they were 2 hours from the German border. It was dreary and cold, and Leo was shivering. He didn't know if it was from the weather or just anticipation. Leo and Manfred had to choose their moment carefully. They had to wait for the train to slow down as it went around a curve, and they also had to wait for the searchlights on top of the train to be pointed away from their car. At just the right moment, Leo spread the bars far enough apart so he and Manfred could slip through. Leo then lifted himself up, rump first, and pulled himself through the window, holding then onto the ledge above the window. The rest of his body followed. As he lowered himself from the window, he's holding on, but he had to kind of throw his body around the edge of the car and lower himself till he felt the coupling. And he landed on the coupling and waited for Manfred to do the same. After Manfred squeezed through the window, they waited for the train to slow down and the beams of the searchlights to be pointed away from them. And at that exact moment, two of them leapt from the train undetected and rolled into a ravine while holding their breath, which seemed like they were holding it for an eternity. The train continued on, didn't know they were gone. They arrived at Auschwitz. When it arrived, 145 men and 82 women were selected for forced labor. Only 4 of them survived the war. The remaining 771 were gassed immediately. 30 years later, German records show Leo as having been killed, but they were wrong. Leo had cheated death once again. He had escaped to live not just for another day, but for another 72 years. In the 70s, a record by Serge Klarsfeld was put together of all the people and their names in small print of those who were shipped out of Drancy, primarily to Auschwitz. Leo was on transport number 42, and they have his name here, and it's misspelled, but it's his name. And if you survive the war, Klarsfeld put an asterisk next to your name. Well, when Leo saw this book in the 1970s, he found his name, and there was no asterisk next to his name. And his wife looked at him and she said, "Leo, you've gone so pale. What's wrong?" He said, "Of course I'm pale. I'm dead." But he wasn't. Okay. So, I have to remember to use this. This is Leo's last interview. It was done by the Washington Post 1 week before he died.
You do a lot of things out of fear to survive. And that's why I'm talking to you. To remember what happened in that train. It's just unbelievable. I had first escaped to Switzerland with false papers. The Swiss arrested me and sent me back to a camp called Rivesaltes in southern France near the Pyrenees. And from Rivesaltes, 109 or 100 and some of us were sent to Drancy because everybody that was supposed to be getting deported went to Drancy. We call it the antechamber of death. When we got to Drancy, they took away our belongings. And when they gave us a receipt for what they took from us, they said, where are you getting to? If you lose this, you will not get your belongings back. They knew exactly where we're going to, we were going to be killed. So that was the deception. But they want us to feel that everything will be all right. It's my friend with whom I escaped. He died a few years ago in Belgium. Cattle cars have 2 windows diagonally across, about like this, with 2 bars in each window. Now, these were the French trains. If they had been the trains that they used in Eastern Europe, we would not have been able to escape, because the bars were not in the frame. They were bolted to the outside of the car. Well, we tried everything to pry these bars apart. We tried belts. There were some ropes on some suitcases. We took these ropes and tied them around. Then a woman, she had a bright idea. When you have a towel and you make it wet, then you wring and wring and wring until the last drop is come out. It becomes more tensile in strength. And this woman said to us, why don't you take off your sweaters? Dip them into that moisture on the floor, human waste. Tie them around the bars and try that. And we did. And we twisted and twisted and twisted. We had our sleeves rolled up. And after a while, all the moisture dripping down on our arms, we had a good sign. Particles of rust came down and they fell on our arms. So we knew that the bars had started to move, twisted. Then we pried them apart and we went back and twisted again to get them to move inward. We did that dozens, if not hundreds of times. And we had to do it fast before we got into Germany proper. I climbed out first. My friend handed me my rucksack, pulled it. Then he came out, and then when the train slowed down, we jumped. Looking at the book of the 76,000 names of the people that were sent away by SNCF. But there, see, there's a name with a dot. The dot means that this is a survivor. There's only 2,000 dots in the 76,000. You do see very few dots.
Okay. Why all this hatred? Anti-Semitism has been called the longest hatred in history. It started well over 2,000 years ago. And their reasoning, I put that in quotes, Jews killed Christ, not knowing, not caring, or forgetting the place where Jesus lived was part of the Roman Empire. Whenever the Romans heard of another kingdom their subjects believed in, like the kingdom of God, it was like, okay, where are they? Let me at them. Romans were ready to conquer it. There would never be a challenge to Rome. Jews were seen by their haters as an enemy, a threat to be converted, expelled, or killed. The supersession myth claimed that Christianity had replaced Judaism because the Jews had failed in their role as the chosen people and deserved punishment. Individual Jews were not judged on their personal achievements or merits, but rather seen on the whole as greedy, lazy, devilish, standoffish, money-grubbing, and oversexed. Jews were falsely accused of using the blood of little Christian babies as part of their Passover holiday ritual, and they called it blood libel. In 1543, Martin Luther gave his own take on the Jews and their religion. He called them poisonous, bitter worms that should be stripped of all their possessions. They should be gathered up and put under one roof, preferably a stable, and made to do hard labor. They should have their homes, their synagogues, and all that they owned burned to the ground. Then drive them out of the country. And mass expulsion of the Jews became an everyday occurrence in England in 1290, in France in 1306 and 1394, Spain in 1492, Austria in 1421, Hungary 1349 to 1360, and also in Portugal and Bohemia. This oppression of the Jews carried through the centuries. In places like what became Germany, for a time Jews were not allowed to own farmland, so they were clustered in the cities. Well, they made a go of it. They opened shops, they had schools, they had banks. They became well educated, and Christians at that time were not allowed to be money lenders. Only for a time. They got over that and then later became bankers and money lenders. This oppression continued until the 19th century when countries influenced by the Enlightenment, this was a movement that based their ideas on reason rather than on traditional religion. They allowed Jews to take part in the life of their country. Well, they were educated. Some became doctors, lawyers, teachers. There were others in the countries that were rather envious of their achievements, and that deep prejudice and hatred of the Jews never truly disappeared. No decade of the 19th century went without someone crying that the Jews were still committing blood libel. Well, there has never been any evidence of that. No amount of education seemed to wipe anti-Semitism from people's souls. During the 1870s, a new political anti-Semitism was joined with racial anti-Semitism. Jew haters began saying that Jews were inferior as a race on the evolutionary scale. And since the problem was genetic, that would never change. They, again, quotes, they concluded that Jews were responsible for all the world's problems because of their race. Well, there is no race, Jewish race. Jews just became the scapegoat. In Germany, a political nationalist movement was taking shape called the Völkisch movement. They opposed industrialization and secularism that came along with modernization. They believed industrialization and secularism were destroying traditional German culture, and they blamed the Jews for this. Jews were undermining our traditional life, and anti-Semitic political parties began to spring up in Germany. In France, okay.
You do a lot of things out of fear.
Okay. In France, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head in the 1890s with the Dreyfus Affair. This is where a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason by those who hated the Jews. It became a political scandal that divided the country. Dreyfus was accused and wrongfully convicted of giving French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris, and he was sentenced to life in prison and sent to a penal colony in French Guiana. He lived there under harsh conditions for 5 years. Then his sentencing was reviewed, and they found out it wasn't Dreyfus at all. It was a man named Esterhazy, but they kept that quiet. And in the meantime, they exonerated Dreyfus in 1906 and said he could continue his career in the army, which he did. This was a grave miscarriage of justice. In Russia, throughout the reign of the czars, anti-Semitism was the official government policy. Jews were restricted to certain areas. There would be periodic pogroms or massacres encouraged by the ruling class. But after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Jews in Russia were granted equal rights. They gave Jew haters across Europe another reason to despise Jews, since they were now seen as communists. In general, the hatred of the Jews could arise out of nowhere. If the economy, took a dip, was bad, it was the Jews' fault. Anti-Semitism could be used as a political ploy when governments were looking for a scapegoat. Some Jews worked toward assimilation, taking full part in society. Aristocratic Jews moved freely with other non-Jewish aristocrats. Others, not wanting any confrontations, retreated into their own communities. Overall, Jews, like anybody else, we're all human. They just wanted to lead quiet, productive, and reasonably comfortable lives. Now, even though there were instances of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, it was still better than what was going on in Eastern Europe. Into this mixed atmosphere, Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. And of course, for his first few years, he's unaware of these anti-Semitic feelings. Adolf's parents, Clara and Alois, were second cousins. His father wanted Adolf to get a good education so that he could become a civil servant just like himself. Well, Adolf didn't want anything to do with that. He wanted to be an artist and didn't want anything to do with civil service. And this put him at odds with his father. And it probably influenced his behavior at school because he didn't pay attention in class, he got bad grades, he was a very poor student, and he never graduated from high school. Adolf and his father argued a lot. To say that their relationship was tumultuous would be an understatement. However, to his mother Clara, Adolf could do no wrong, and she tried to protect him at every turn. She always defended him. And as a result, she could also be manipulated by Adolf. Alois Hitler died in 1903, and from that point on, Adolf mounted a campaign to pressure his mother into letting him go to Vienna to attend the Fine Arts Academy. Finally, in 1907, his mother gave in. She gave her permission, and she gave him a little bit of money. So he went to Vienna with big dreams, high hopes, and a very high opinion of himself and his artistic abilities. In December of 1907, Adolf's mother, Clara, died of cancer. Adolf was devastated. Her doctor was Jewish, and many feel that Adolf blamed him for her death and perhaps contributed to his growing feelings of anti-Semitism. But at the time his mother was dying of cancer, he was living in Vienna where anti-Semitism was rather prevalent. Adolf tried to gain acceptance to the Fine Arts Academy twice. All right, these are his drawings, his paintings. They look pretty darn good to me. I can't do stick figures. But at both times, the acceptance board at the Art Academy said they lean more toward architectural drawings rather than what they were looking for, and maybe he should become an architect. Well, Hitler also did not have the required high school diploma, so he couldn't have gotten in anyway. He couldn't have gotten into the Fine Arts Academy, and he wouldn't be able to get into any architectural school. When Hitler was turned down for the second time, he started blaming the Jews on the acceptance board. It didn't occur to him that he hadn't fulfilled even the most basic requirement for acceptance, which was a high school diploma. He always blamed someone else. Not me, He took no responsibility at all. It was the board's fault that he could not become a great artist. Now, while he was in Vienna, he lived very poorly. He didn't have a whole lot of money, so he drew postcards and sold them on street corners. He did odd jobs. He ate at soup kitchens, and at night he slept in male shelters or hostels. So here we have some of his flaws. He felt he was superior to his father. He had a very high opinion of himself and his abilities. He never took responsibility for his lack of ability or lack of preparation. Jews were always to blame. Jews were his scapegoat because he could never accept the truth. Now, when World War I began in 1914, Hitler was born in Austria. He decided, I don't want to fight in the Austrian army. So he left Austria before they could draft him. He joined the German army instead. He served in both France and Belgium and was decorated twice for bravery. And he rose to the rank of corporal. He was also injured twice. The second time was in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. He was blinded by a gas attack. He was sent to a hospital to be treated, and he hoped he could get his sight back. While recovering, Germany surrendered in 1918, and this totally enraged him. Hitler said that it was the betrayal of an undefeated Germany by Jews and socialists. He stated vehemently that the Jews did not serve in the army. Jewish bankers didn't give enough money to the cause. Well, again, a lie. Out of the 615,000 German Jews in Germany in 1914, over 100,000 did serve in the army, and over 12,000 Jews were killed when they were serving. After World War I, German Jews were active in rebuilding Germany and propping up the new government, the Weimar Republic. Hitler also said the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war was a humiliation for the German people. The Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany entirely for the war. And of course, Hitler blamed the Jews. In his mind, it couldn't be the German army's fault or their leader, the Kaiser's, fault. Hitler had found his scapegoat in the Jews. Germany was also required to pay reparations. They had to pay for the entire cost of the war, which at that time was 132 billion gold marks, which came out to $33 billion at the end of the war. And by the way, the reparations were finally paid in full in 2010, and it made the cover of Time magazine. So Hitler kept blaming the Jews for Germany's humiliation, and his hatred grew and knew no bounds. In the turmoil of defeat, and more accusatory voices were being raised, and anti-Semitism was growing amongst the Germans. Oop. Okay. Sorry. Anti-Semitism was becoming the basis for a new political party in Germany. It was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, shortened to the NSDAP, or what we commonly know them by, the Nazi Party. Hitler also was asked by the army before he got out of the army to infiltrate this new party and report back on their goings-on. Hitler joined the party undercover, but discovered he liked what he heard, and he started speaking out at these meetings. And he discovered he had a talent for making speeches. What he would do, he had his own little technique. He would go to his podium and wait for absolute quiet. You could hear a pin drop. When he had that quiet, he then started to speak very softly. So everybody was sitting on the edges of their seats. And then he would get louder and louder and louder, voicing their fears and their complaints. And it just aroused them and brought them to his side. He would talk about their fears, their worries, but then he would twist them and manipulate them to his own ends. Hitler also discovered that if you say something long enough and loud enough, people will believe you. Lies. Just believe his lies. Hitler rose through the ranks of this Nazi party and even helped them write the party platform. All right, there he is. All right, he had talent for public speaking. He voiced their fears and twisted them around to his own ends, and it was nothing but lies. All right, as he rose through the ranks, he did help them write their own party platform. And first and foremost, we are a nationalist state. That means the state comes first, individual rights be damned. He wanted to create a great Germany and came up with the slogan, "Make Germany Great Again." Their former colonies, he said, that had been taken away by the Treaty of Versailles needed to be returned to them. They discussed birthright citizenship. Only those of poor German blood could be considered citizens of Germany. And to him, that meant, I don't care if Jews were born here, they aren't German. Only Aryans were allowed, those of the Aryan race. Well, there is no such thing as the Aryan race. There was an Aryan tribe that moved into northern India many centuries ago, but there is no Aryan race. It was non-existent. All Jews, the platform went on to say, who came to Germany after 1914 were to be returned to their countries. So deportations. 18,000 Jews would be affected by this, and they would be forced to leave Germany, their home. At Hitler's rallies, he told crowds that his party and his party alone would free them from the power of the Jew. He then demanded the removal of Jews from the German people. Okay, so Germany would be a nationalist state. The state comes first. Individual rights, well, they aren't worth looking at, he felt. He coined the slogan, "Make Germany Great Again." He spoke of birthright citizenship, deportation of Jews, and he had rallies. Now, in 1921, Hitler created the SA, the stormtroopers, and I don't speak German, the Sturmabteilung. It was his own little paramilitary group. Most people just called them the SA or brown shirts. These people would go out and harass those, people who were opposed to Hitler or people who didn't raise their arm in salute to Hitler, or Jews, it didn't matter. They would go after them rather brutally, and they were very emotional and could be quite savage. Hitler always got someone else to act for him. So he never really got his hands dirty. I didn't do that, somebody else did it, but they did it as his command. Without any evidence or truth, he would go on in his speeches and accuse Jewish boys of lying in wait for unsuspecting true German girls because they wanted to seduce them and adulterate their blood and separate them from their families and their people. Jews would do anything to undermine the racial foundations of the German people. They wanted to muddy the Aryan bloodline. Now, to Germans, the Aryans were pure lily white. Hitler often said, as long as our people remain racially pure and are conscious of the treasure of their blood, they can never be overcome by the Jew. Never can the Jew become the master of any people except a bastardized people. His hate speech was becoming more and more vile, and it was filled with lies, lies, and more lies, but people ate it up. Again, Hitler practiced that old technique. If you say something loud enough and long enough, people will believe you. They would believe your lies no matter how absurd. And Voltaire has said, if someone can make you believe absurdities, they can make you commit atrocities. In the early 1920s, many Germans began to buy into what Hitler was selling. The Weimar Republic was only just beginning, so they weren't terribly stable at the beginning. Their economy was bad, and remember, Germany owed all that money in reparations. So Hitler took advantage of this and gave Germans a reason for the loss of the war, the humiliation, and their bad economy. It was because of the Jews. In November of 1923, things began to heat up for him and the Nazis. On November 8th and 9th in 1923, Hitler and 3,000 of his followers tried to take over Bavaria in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It was an attempted coup. It was a violent uprising where 16 Nazis and 3 policemen were killed. And some even thought that Hitler was amongst the dead. If only. But no, Hitler lived on. Whoops. Okay. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he only served 9 months. While in jail, Hitler wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, where he laid out his plan for European takeover and his ideas on race. He said Jews were parasites and should be exterminated. They were the rats in the larder. So he's getting into name calling. And the Aryan race is the master race. He went on to say dictatorship or authoritarianism should govern. All right, so we have, all right, he was a convicted criminal who never served much time in jail. He then continued with his name calling and promoted dictatorship. When his book came out in 1925, people thought, one, the book was very poorly written, and two, this guy is nuts, which tells you to trust your first impression. Also in 1925, the economy of Germany was improving a little. The Weimar was stabilizing a bit. And people were starting to believe in their new government. People weren't paying as much attention to Hitler as they had been. In 1925, Hitler created another group of men to protect him and other leaders of the Nazi Party, and they were called the Schutzstaffen, or the SS. In 1926, there were 17,000 Nazis. By 1927, a year later, Nazi membership was 40,000. SS stormtroopers were active on the streets, and they were really street thugs, but the party gave them a bit of respectability. In 1928, Nazis gained 12 seats in the Reichstag, the German parliament. And then the crash came, the Wall Street stock market crash in 1929. Many countries, including their investments, were affected, including Germany's. Some began thinking, well, maybe democracy isn't the way to go. Inflation and unemployment rose. Millions and millions were out of work in Germany. And at this point, it seemed like Germany was ripe for a new leader. So Hitler was ready to step into the breach and take over, saying only he could make Germany great again. More and more people started listening to him, thinking after the crash, maybe he wasn't so nuts. In 1932, the Nazis' seats in the Reichstag rose from 12 to 230 out of 607. Nazis were then the largest party in parliament, but they weren't the majority. So Hitler decided he wanted to be Chancellor of Germany, but because they weren't the majority party, he would have to share power with the other representatives of the other parties. And in a lot of history books, it just says Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. And he was made Chancellor by Paul von Hindenburg, who was president of Germany at that time. However, I found a book, a diary. It's called A Diary of a Man in Despair. It's a diary of Friedrich Percival Reck Malesheim. He kept a diary about Hitler and what Hitler was doing in Germany in the 30s and the 40s. And for that, he was eventually arrested by the Gestapo in October of 1944. He was taken to Dachau, where he died under questionable circumstances in February of 1945, just for keeping a diary. I say it's questionable because some people, the Nazis said he died of disease. That was their, yeah, everybody dies of disease. We didn't do anything. But other people were saying, he was murdered. But he brought up some questions. He wrote about the time when Hitler wanted to become chancellor. The Nazis said, we have something on Paul von Hindenburg's son. Hindenburg was very old and very sickly and not very rich, and he had hoped that he would be able to leave his son something when he died. So he allowed his son to take state money and invest it in the stock market, and it was doing quite well until it wasn't, until the crash, and then he lost everything. The Nazis said, we know about it, and we will put him in jail. Well, they said all this to Hindenburg. It is said by many that Hindenburg hated Hitler, and he wasn't really clear on who was standing in front of him and what was going on because he was in and out of consciousness at the time, and he was just very sick. So he finally agreed to make Hitler chancellor of a coalition government in January of 1933. And he hated, Hitler himself hated having to share power with anybody. Then February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag, the parliament building, burned. And the Nazis and Hitler are saying, it's the communists that did it. The communists did it. So they set about arresting communists. Then Hitler went to Hindenburg and convinced him to declare a state of emergency. Well, and when Hindenburg did, then the Nazis took full control. If you ever hear someone declare a state of emergency, you can kiss your rights goodbye and you don't know if they're ever coming back, because that's the first thing Hitler did. He suspended all freedoms, and the Nazis consolidated their power. So had the state of emergency declared, rights and freedoms were done away with, he consolidated Nazi power, and in March of 1933, he declared himself dictator, the Führer, the leader. He could then make any law he wanted by the stroke of a pen, or he could just say, I don't like that law, I'm not going to follow it. So he then took away freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Nazis took away also the right to privacy. They could walk in your house anytime they wanted. They didn't need a warrant. They could read your mail and bug your phones. Okay. Hitler had his dictatorship, and his hatred of the Jews could run wild. He said Jews were not true Germans, so they should be moved out further east. On the 1st of April, 1933, Nazis declared a boycott of all Jewish businesses in Germany. The 7th of April, Jews who were civil servants lost their jobs and their equal rights. On the 21st of April, Jewish dietary laws were prohibited. And on the 25th of April, limits were placed on the number of Jews who could attend school. On May 10th, book burnings of anti-Nazi tracts and any Jewish authored books and any opponents to Hitler, all those books were burned. July 14th, there was forced sterilization of citizens with disabilities. Now, attacks by the SA continued on the Jews and even on foreigners. If there was a foreigner in a town who passed stormtroopers and they didn't raise their hand and say, Heil Hitler, they would beat that person up. And there is one instance where the SA tortured one man, an American, by stripping off his skin, and then he was delivered to the American embassy. The SA was free to do their dirty work until the night of the Long Knives that took place June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. Now that the SA worked very well for Hitler in the early years, punching it out with people, getting them to back Hitler. But now that Hitler was chancellor, he thought he needed a more dignified group to defend him. So he decided he wanted to get rid of the SA because they're too emotional, not well disciplined. And he did that on the night of the Long Knives. On the night of the Long Knives, the SA was gathered in this one area, and the leaders of the SA were taken to individual private rooms, handed a gun, and told to do the right thing. Well, the ultimate leader of the SA was a man named Röhm. He refused, and so they shot him dead. The rest of the SA, the foot soldiers, were either assigned other duties, can you follow these other leaders and leave Rome behind? Or, do we have to get rid of you too? So many of them were assigned other duties. The SS then became the most prominent group and the most feared. Now, it took usually about 2 years of training to become an SS officer. They wanted the SS to blindly follow whatever they were told to do. Don't question anything. So at the beginning of their training, they were given a puppy. They were to raise the puppy, train the puppy, eat with the puppy, feed the puppy, sleep with the puppy as it grew over these 2 years. And the last test to see if they could become SS officers was to slit their dogs' throats. Blindly follow an order. Attacks on the Jews continued and increased. Jews walking down the street could be assaulted and beaten by a gang of Nazis or even the Hitler Youth that had been started. I used to have my students bring one student up and kind of face their backs to a wall and say, why didn't you come to this Nazi meeting? Why aren't you wearing that pin? Until they were pinned up against the wall and didn't quite understand what was going on. But that's what they would do. They would confront people in the street if they didn't have their little Nazi pin on, or if they had been invited to come to a Nazi meeting and they did not show, they would be targeted. In 1935, the Nazis came up with their Nuremberg laws. Jewish citizenship was then removed so they could more easily remove the Jews from Germany. The law also defined who was Jewish. Now, you may have thought you were, a Lutheran, a Presbyterian, some other religion, but if you look back at your ancestry and you had a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a great-grandmother, anybody who was Jewish, then you were considered Jewish. And you might not even know it. Jewish officers were expelled from the army, and there could be no marriages between a Jew and an Aryan, a German, a true German. So there were a lot of divorces or annulments or broken engagements. Then, on March 13th, 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. When Hitler rode through Vienna, there were cheering crowds with their little Nazi flags, you can see in the picture, just waving them back and forth. They were thrilled. Hitler was an Austrian, and now he's come in and come back to us, and we are now included in Greater Germany, and they were happy about it, and they knew his views on Jews. The crowds just cheered and cheered and cheered, and when Hitler rode through Vienna, every once in a while he might turn his head, but basically he just stood and looked straight ahead. He might glance side to side, and he'd have his little arm up for these cheering crowds. Jews, for good reason, were fearful, and anti-Jewish policies were put into place right away after he took over Austria. Soon after Hitler rode through the streets, some of the streets on their cobblestones in red paint had anti-Hitler slogans painted. So to get the maximum effect, the Nazis, either officers or Hitler Youth, got doctors, lawyers, teachers, anyone of higher standing that could be humiliated to get down on their hands and knees with a toothbrush and scrape off the paint on the roads, just for the humiliation factor. Young Jewish men were being rounded up, and they were told they were being sent to labor camps. Their families, a few months later, might get them back in a little box with a note saying, your son died of disease. They don't know if they were truly their son's ashes, and they figured they didn't necessarily die from disease. In more recent years, Austrians have said, we were Hitler's first victims. A lot of people disagree with that because they're out there with their flags waving with big smiles on their faces. November 7th, 1938, there was a young man by the name of Herschel Greenspan who killed a German diplomat in Paris because of treatment to his father, ill treatment of his father. Herschel was living in Paris with an uncle, and he got a postcard from his father saying that he had been removed from Germany and they wanted to send him back to Poland, but Poland didn't want him, so he's kind of hanging in limbo. Herschel's father came to Germany in 1911, opened a shop, was doing very well, but he was subject to deportation, even though he got there before 1914. And they rounded up a group of Jews to send back to Poland, but at that point, the war hadn't started. Poland had a say, and they said, no, you can't send them back. So they're kind of hanging out in this limbo. Herschel found out about it, was angry. He wanted to kill the German ambassador, but I think he killed a second secretary or something, a diplomat at the German embassy. He was caught, arrested, and in response to what he did, if you do one thing to make a point, the Nazis would do something worse 100 times over, 1,000 times over. So the result of this killing of the diplomat was the Night of Shattered Glass, or Kristallnacht, which took place on the night of November 9th through the 10th. On Kristallnacht, the Nazis attacked Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues, tearing them apart, breaking windows, setting them, especially synagogues, on fire. It is estimated there were 7,000 businesses ruined and 1,400 synagogues burned. About 100 Jews were murdered, and more were arrested and sent to Dachau, Germany's first concentration camp, and they estimate that 30,000 were sent to Dachau. November 12th, 1938, all Jewish businesses were forcibly handed over to Germans. Jews were forbidden from practicing medicine or law or attending universities. And they put an overall fine on Jews in Germany of 1 billion Reichsmarks. November 15th, 1938, Jewish children were banned from German schools. Now, before this time, they had moved Jewish children to the back of the classroom where they were subjected to all the insults of their fellow classmates they used to play with. But now they were not allowed in schools at all. More than 340,000 Jews emigrated from Germany and Austria. Hitler encouraged them to leave, albeit without any money or their possessions. Of these, about 100,000 who fled to other European countries were killed during the Holocaust. In 1938, in Evian, France, they had a conference where countries were invited to come together, and it would be decided who would take in refugees. Well, the US said no, England said no, other countries said no. The only two that said they would accept Jewish refugees were the Dominican Republic. They said they'd take 30,000, and Bolivia. Everybody else said, nope, not us. In June 1939, 937 Jewish refugees were on the ship, the St. Louis. They were hoping that the United States or Cuba would accept them, going right up to the front door of the countries, and they were turned away. They had to go back to Europe, occupied by the Nazis. And in the end, England did take in some, France and the Netherlands took in some. 254 died in the Holocaust. That could have been saved. Then on September 1st, 1939, World War II began with Hitler's blitzkrieg attack on Poland, only after he had struck a deal with Russia. It was the Nazi-Soviet pact. Hitler said, okay, you Russians, you can go in Poland from the east, we will go in from the west, and we'll split the country down the middle. And you can have that. Now, he didn't do that because he liked Russians or he liked Stalin. He did it because he didn't want a two-front war. That had helped defeat them in World War I. So he was very conscious of that. So they were going to split the country. Hitler used his blitzkrieg attack when going into Poland. That is air cover with bombing from the sky, tanks, foot soldiers, all working very, very fast to take over. In every territory Hitler took over, he enacted his racial policies. Thousands of Jews were forced into ghettos where there was overcrowding, poverty, unemployment, hunger, and disease. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest in Poland, and this was an area of 1.3 square miles, and Nazis brought in Jews from all over Poland into the Warsaw Ghetto. At its height, there were 400,000 people in that 1.3 square mile area, which came out to 7.2 people per room in the existing buildings. Periodically, the Nazis would gather 1,000 people from this ghetto and ship them out to a camp, usually Treblinka, where most of them were killed within the first hour and a half of arrival. Now, you see the picture with the circle around that man's head? That man is Martin Gray, and he wrote 12 books, but his first book was For Those I Love. This picture wasn't discovered until maybe 10 years ago, and he was quite surprised that they found it. Okay, would anyone like to take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back? Anyone need a break? Okay, 5 minutes, and then we'll continue and have some questions. Okay. I think my mic is on, isn't it? Okay. I'm wired for sound. Okay. All right, so we talked about the Warsaw Ghetto and how they would have the roundups and send 1,000 people off to mostly Treblinka. And upon arrival at Treblinka, the women and the men were separated. There would be this selection process. And the elderly and young children would go with the women. And then the men were taken to an open area like a parade ground and told to run in a circle and not stop until they were told to stop. They would run and run and run and run. In the meantime, if anybody stopped or fell or slowed things down, they would just be shot. The women, the elderly, and children were marched down a street called Himmelstrasse. It was translated to the road to heaven. At the end of this road was the building that housed the so-called showers. They were stripped of their clothing and entered the shower room. They pushed in as many women, children, and elderly as they could. Then they closed the door, locked it, and turned on the gas, Zyklon B. When they would die fairly quickly. And when I talk about the showers, I get this picture in my head. Many years ago, when I would see pictures of the showers, you could see where people were clawing at the walls and on the ceiling. And after I went to Auschwitz, you don't see them anymore. I guess they've just been sanded away or plastered over. They kind of cleaned it up. So the people would die fairly quickly from the gas, and then the Sonderkommandos would be sent in. They were male prisoners who would take out the bodies, put them in a pit, and then hose down the shower and get them ready for the next group to come in. When it came time for the men to go down the road to heaven, they were too tired to fight back. And that was the purpose of them running, to tire them out. Hitler's goal was to kill as many Jews as possible. Hitler also wanted Jews not rounded up to stand out. So in Poland, they had a white armband with a blue Star of David. In other countries, you might remember the star with the word Juif on it in that video I showed you, Leo's star. He said he took his off, he put it in his shoe and only brought it out if he absolutely had to. So in French-speaking areas, the star would say Juif, and in German-speaking areas, it was Juden. They would have written on it. Their papers would have a big J stamped on it, so people would know that you were Jewish. Jews were told they must wear that star. If they didn't and someone recognized them as a Jew, then they would be shot. Hitler also had others experiment on political prisoners, political opponents, the mentally ill, communists, gypsies, and homosexuals. He wanted to know, for example, how long it would take Zyklon B to kill a person. Then the Nazis would know how long it would take to kill those in the so-called showers. He also ordered others to fill a bus with people, usually people from institutions, the mentally ill, those with disabilities. They would put them in a bus, take a hose, stick it in the exhaust pipe, put it into the bus. They wanted to see how long it would take to kill them. If that was effective, then they would be saving needed bullets. Other camps were established to kill Jews and other opponents to Hitler. For example, all right, we have Auschwitz. You see the entrance there, Arbeit macht frei, with the B upside down. That was the person putting that sign together did that deliberately. It was his act of resistance, to make it upside down. So in Auschwitz, you had 1.3 million Jews entering that camp. 1.1 million died, most of them in the gas chamber. Others died from overwork, starvation, and disease. Nazis also experimented with how they could get people off the trains without freaking them out. They wanted to keep the prisoners as calm as possible. At Treblinka, they built up a facade of a regular train station so that when the people got off the train, they're thinking, well, they told us they were just going to move us east, give us housing, give us other jobs. Just, they wanted us out of Germany. Maybe what they told us was true. This looks normal. But then from behind the facade, the Nazi officers, the SS, would come out with their dogs and start the selection process. They even had a band playing to make them feel more relaxed. So, no, work will set you free, is what it says. Okay, the selection process was started, women and the elderly and children on one side, men on the other. If anyone objected or if they did freak out when they brought out the dogs, they would be shot, and that seemed to quiet the other people around. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking Nazi Party and German government officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of, all right, my English pronounces it Wannsee, but you said it much better. Wannsee. To discuss how to carry out Hitler's final solution for the Jews. This mass murder by Nazis and their collaborators would require cooperation of government agencies throughout German-occupied Europe, and they even had a bit of help from IBM in gathering names and locations. The SS figured that 11 million Jews would be eradicated through this effort. That would include Jews in neutral countries and in the UK. Otherwise, it was estimated that there were 10 million. The final solution was the code name for this deliberate annihilation of European Jews sanctioned by Hitler. No one at the conference objected to this genocide. Germans attempted to disguise their deadly intentions by portraying the deportations as resettlement, of the Jewish population to labor camps where they would be fed and have jobs and housing. They were sent to the east. Jews would be transported in freight cars, cattle cars, or some were in passenger cars. On occasion, they would be on a truck. Normally, they would not be given any food, water, or any kind of facilities, except for that bucket. Sometimes they were given a small piece of cheese and a small piece of bread, and they would travel to a camp. On occasion, they would uncouple a car and just leave it in the hot sun or the cold, so everybody in that car would die. Because of this final solution, Germans created more killing centers. Auschwitz and Treblinka were already in operation. Other extermination camps were under construction. Between 1941 and 1942, the SS and police established 5 killing centers: Chelmno, Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka II, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, or Auschwitz II. There were others as well. I have a friend from Yugoslavia her family was Jewish, and they were thrown in jail when she was only 4 years old. Some of her relatives were sent to a camp called Jasenovich, which was one of the worst camps around. When they were first put in jail in her little town of Glina in Yugoslavia, her uncle, who was Catholic, stole an SS uniform and orders and got them out, took them to Split, where they lived for a year in hiding, and then he arranged for a fishing boat to take them to Italy, where they survived the war, with the exception of some of their male relatives who were taken to Jasenovac. Sachsenhausen was another camp that was established. It was north of Berlin in the town of Oranienburg. I visited there, and when you went in front of you were some barracks, or where barracks were, and off to the right, but behind those barracks was a special punishment camp for opponents or prisoners that were deemed especially distasteful. So they would put them in these little cells. Sometimes the cells, they lowered the ceiling to about this high, and they couldn't stand up, and they were small, and no windows, no air. Otherwise, if they needed extra punishment, they had, it's like cut off telephone poles outside with hooks on them, where they would tie their hands together and hold them up like this and put them on a hook and just let them dangle. There were no stops for what Nazis would do. When I went there, there was also a part of the camp off to the left. You would go through, and whenever you heard loud music being played, you knew something bad was going to happen. They would take some prisoners and they would walk down to a ramp and there was a wall and shoot them. Or if you went to the medical center when you first came in, they would tell you to stand against a wall where they would take your height. But behind you, there was a little hole in the wall, and they'd move it and just shoot you in the neck. In this special part of the camp, wherever you walked, you were walking on ashes. They first started dumping ashes in the river, but that came too full. So then they just didn't know what else to do. They just spread them out. So it was just, there are no words to describe what went on there. As I said earlier, there were 42,500 camps established. Labor camps, transit camps, ghettos, concentration, and extermination camps. All of this because of hatred. Roundups of the Jews took place all over German-occupied Europe. In France, there was what was called the Vélodrome d'hiver roundup, or sometimes they shorten it to Veldiv. This was the largest French deportation of Jews during the Holocaust. It took place in Paris on July 16th and 17th, 1942. Carried out by French policemen. I guess they wanted to show them how nice they could be to their Nazi occupiers. The French police carried out the mass arrest of some 13,000 Jewish men, women, and children. Beginning in the early hours of July 16th, French police rounded up 2,573 men, 5,165 women, and 3,625 children. The roundup continued through the 17th of July. 6,000 of these people were immediately taken to the Drancy transport camp north of Paris, where they would be shipped out to Auschwitz. The rest were taken to the Vélodrome d'hiver, which was a winter cycling track. It was an indoor track, and the track itself kind of went up like that on the sides, and then there was stadium seating going up. They pushed all these people into the Vélodrome d'hiver, which was near the Eiffel Tower. It's no longer there. There is a historic marker, but that's about it. The crowding in this cycling stadium was unbearable. Some 7,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, were squeezed in. There was no food, no water. Sanitary facilities were either overwhelmed or bathrooms were locked. So you had to relieve yourself wherever you could find a spot. And they were there for 5 days. Jews were held there for 5 days before being transferred to transit camps, usually sent to Auschwitz, with the help of the SNCF, the French National Railroad. They could not have transported these people without the help of the French Railroad. The SNCF was paid for every person on board. They were paid for every kilometer and paid for every trip. And this continued even after Paris had been liberated. My friend Leo told me that he saw the bill that the SNCF sent the Germans after Paris had been liberated. German authorities continued the deportation of Jews from France until August of 1944, because the Allies had landed on June 6, 1944, moving to push the Germans out and back to Germany. In all, some 77,000 Jews living in France perished. Most of them were murdered at Auschwitz. France was just one country where this horror took place. Why? Because these men, women, and children were born, and born Jewish. Why? Because of lies and hatred. Why? Because of the Germans' misplaced feelings of superiority with their Aryan race. Why? Because of their own inadequacies. You must put someone else down sometimes to raise yourself up. Numbers like 6 million plus is a very dry way of giving you a picture of what happened. And out of that 6 million, as I said, 1.5 million were children. And as Leah would say, they were ordinary children, but we never would find out if they could have been extraordinary. There was a special campaign by the Nazis to kill children because they would grow up and have more babies, and they didn't want that. So stop them when they're young. Every one of these human beings killed had a name, a family, hopes and dreams for the future. They weren't just numbers. Hitler, as much as he tried to get others to do his dirty work, wasn't able to murder all of Europe's Jews, although it is thought that he killed 2/3 of them. However, 3.5 million Jews survived. Allied troops landed at Normandy in France on June 6, 1944. They then began to push the Nazis out of France and other Western European nations, sending them back to Germany. As these Allied troops moved across Europe in 1944 and 1945, they encountered concentration camps, mass graves, and other sites of Nazi crimes. The unspeakable conditions the liberators confronted shed light on Nazi atrocities. Soviets liberated Auschwitz, Nazis' largest killing center, in January of 1945. Also Majdanek, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück. Americans liberated Buchenwald, Dora, Bittelbau, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, Dachau, among others. British forces liberated concentration camps in northern Germany, including Neuengamme and Bergen-Belsen. When Eisenhower and other generals came across these camps, Eisenhower said he wanted his troops to march through these camps to see what had been done so they would know why they were fighting. He also brought in townspeople, the mayor of these different towns, who said, oh, we didn't know what was going on. Well, they couldn't help it. You know, they could The camps were right there. They had dealings with the camps, and you could smell them. As Allied troops got closer to these camps, Himmler ordered the prisoners in those camps to be moved to the interior of Germany. In Auschwitz, they had a death march, they called it, where those who were still alive were marched 44 miles to a train that would take them further inland in Germany. There's a gentleman, Thomas Bergenthal, that I'll speak about on Thursday, was part of that death march. He was 10 years old at the end of the war. And what he did, when they had the children at the front of the march, and anyone that slowed down the march would be shot. So the kids were in front, and when Tom would get tired, he said he'd just walk more slowly and filtered to the end of the group, and then he'd slowly walk back up and join the children. But it took days and days, and many died along the way, which was one of their goals. There was a gentleman who came here to speak as part of the Joan Crawford lecture series years ago, named Saul Goldstein. To me, he was like Forrest Gump. He was 18 when he joined the Army. He's very tall, very skinny. He was one who landed on the beaches of Normandy, survived, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and survived. At that point, he was a sergeant major, and his commanding officer told him to take a few other soldiers and look for Americans because their radios no longer worked. So he's out in this Jeep driving around, and they come upon Buchenwald. He thought it was a POW camp. And he and the men with him, they drove through the fence, and there were no guards around. And he said, I saw these ghosts. I cannot call them men. They were ghosts. And one approached him, and Saul said, I am an American, and I am a Jew. And the man said, what took you so long to come? That always gets me. And they were the first ones to discover Buchenwald, and then others followed. But Saul said he could never go back to Germany. He could never set foot in that country. When they walked through the camps, liberators found piles of corpses that lay unburied, piles of ash, piles of bones. They found shoes and glasses and brushes for shaving cream and suitcases, anything the prisoners found, had brought with them. There were skeletal people, so weak they could hardly move. Disease was present, like typhoid, and many of the camps had to be burned to the ground to stop epidemics. Survivors of the camps faced a long and difficult road to recovery. It was a daunting task of rebuilding their lives, trying to find family members, moving to new areas, not their homes, because sometimes when they returned to their home, someone else was living in their house, their apartment, and they were not going to leave, and the war had not done anything to dampen their anti-Semitism. In Poland, when that happened, there were deaths because of it. So many went to displaced persons camps, and where they got health care and food. There were religious services. They could trace their relatives, and they had help finding new homes. Now, hatred was everywhere, and hatred, unfortunately, is still with us today. But not everyone hated. During World War II, many non-Jews risked their lives and the lives of their families in order to help Jews. They hid Jews in their homes. Sometimes entire towns were told, you will hide Jews. That way you can't rat on each other. And many, if one person decided to hide a Jew and that Jew was discovered, then the whole family that wasn't Jewish would be killed. So they took a chance. Many who helped were killed. And in World War II, you saw the worst of humanity and you also saw the best. But when racism, religious bigotry, the quest for power and money rears its ugly head, it calls on all of us to act, to stand up and say no. Hatred destroys. And I am reminded of a song from an old movie, some of you might remember, South Pacific. Anybody remember that movie? There was a song in there that seems appropriate. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught. Sounds better when it's sung. But if anyone has any questions, on Thursday I'll talk about survivors. Some I've known, some I did not. And how they went on with their lives after the war, many of them giving back to a world that wanted them dead. So if anyone has any questions. Yes? Anne? What? Taxes? Stealing? Companies? They got their salaries. They weren't paid a whole lot, but they had a job and food was scarce and they would do they're trying to protect their families, get food for their families. Many of them just did what they were told. And, I don't know. They had money set aside for the military. They had people making contributions that backed them. Big companies making money off of the contracts, that supported them. Dick?
Story of this whole Holocaust thing, and you see the victims being transported to these camps.
Mm-hmm.
You see them sitting there and waiting to board the trains or board the whatever be boarding. Don't see any active resistance. Now, I'm wondering if the Germans didn't go to great lengths to make sure that the Jews who had not reached that point were not aware of what their ultimate destination was going to be. They weren't aware that they were going to be slaughtered and killed and die.
There were rumors that they would be. And if anyone tried to escape, they were shot. And that quieted some people. If you're a mother with children you have to protect, you're going to do what you have to do to protect them. And hopefully what you were told about a new job and a new house in the East would be there waiting for you. Oh, yeah, right and left. They did not, as I'll talk about Thursday, they did not walk quietly to the ovens as the Germans would like you to believe. They resisted, and there were many, many different ways to resist. Yeah, and Elie Wiesel said, it's amazing there was as much resistance as there was because they were starved. There wasn't enough food to go around. They might get 400 calories a day, if that. So, yeah.
One of the theories about the passivity rests on the history of pogroms all through Europe, as you alluded to, for hundreds of years. So that at first, a lot of Jews believed that this was just another pogrom
Mhm.
they would really take those steps. They did not believe what was going to happen until it was too late. That's one of the
Mhm.
popular historical theories.
Yeah, and you're in shock when things start to change, and you can't believe that the change is going to last. And when it did last for many, it was too late. They don't realize it, and when people would try to warn them, you know, you're full of it. That's not going to happen. You know, these are civilized people. No, that's not going to happen. But when it finally hits them as an individual, it's too late. You know, the changes are there. You've got to obey, or you're dead. Mhm. Hitler made a deal with Hungary. He wanted to use their roads toward Russia. And so he kind of left Hungary till the end. And so what was going on in other countries, they didn't believe it was going to happen to them. In Elie Wiesel's book, Night, he talks about this man who saw things, who knew what was going on, came back to tell these people in his town what was going on, and they just went, people have a tendency not to believe the truth if it goes against what they think is going on. And that happened then, it happens today, happens all through time. They just choose not to believe the truth if it goes against what they think.
Especially when this truth is so barbaric.
Mhm.
You don't grow up thinking that this could really happen, right? I can see myself as a Jew, well, they're not going to do this, and these women or whatever. I mean, that's so barbaric. Even the Germans wouldn't use such a thing, right? And I can see some of that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, we're too civilized, and nobody could imagine that kind of evil because nobody would do it. Nobody in their right mind would do that. We would try to upset the government of the time and spread the evil, just spew that poison that so many, and then gets these people riled up at the rallies. And Rick Steves just did his one of his programs. I don't know whether you all know about him. He's a travel person, and he's got all these programs. He has one that he's done something about fascism in Europe,
Mhm.
and then he's done another one, traveling the political. And he's showing Nuremberg these massive open fields.
Yeah. They people I would try and point out to my students when I was teaching that there are patterns to history, things that repeat. And because people don't know their history or value knowing their history, these patterns repeat. Even though whatever it was has never worked in the past, they try it anyway, and it might work for a little bit and then it doesn't work again. But in the meantime, millions are hurt, killed, and things are destroyed because people don't know their history. I would have students, I'd say, why are you taking this class? And they'd say, I have to. I said, you can't say anything I haven't heard before. And every once in a while, there'd be somebody there that really wanted to learn it. And it's not, somebody would say, well, it's dead. I said, no, it's not. It's there to learn from. And a lot of people, they're into math or they're into other things and they poo-poo it. It's not worth my time. But if they did, we would avoid a whole lot of problems, I think. Any other questions or comments? Okay, on Thursday I'll talk about some friends of mine and some I don't know that survived the Holocaust and what they did to give back. And then we'll look at a speech that Bill Clinton gave on the 20th anniversary of the Holocaust Museum. It's extraordinary.
Does anybody remember when South Pacific came out?
It's in the 50s.
Because the words to this song are so clear, and Hollywood uses entertainment to make a point. I'm reminded by the research that Rick Steves did, and when Hitler was coming up through the ranks and formulating his evil plan, he learned from Mussolini, liked his evil plan, and this has been corroborated by a lot of other people, and I don't mean to offend anybody here. I was raised Roman Catholic, but the things I've learned about the Catholic faith since my days in college makes my skin crawl. Hitler went to Pope Pius XII, who was a sympathizer to the Nazis, and he went to Pius XII to learn how to indoctrinate the children and get the children to turn on their parents. The Soviets did the same thing with theirs. Father, learn this.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Yes. Fallen Angel. Daniel De Silva. He has a lot of good books. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. There are a lot of good books out there. When I would study this, and I did for a long time, I would periodically have to take a break because it was too much. I'd start getting nightmares, and it was always the same nightmare. And I'd put it aside. When I was young, I'd put it aside and read the Happy Hollisters for a while, and then I'd go back to it. But I was taking a break from it, and then I picked up the book Sarah's Key. And I don't know if any of you have read it. That just woke me up again. And that's how I met Leo, because his book was listed in the back and said he lived in Baltimore. And I wrote him a letter and asked if he said he gave talks, so I asked if he'd come out here. And he wrote back, and when I got his letter, then he called me on the phone. And we became, excuse me? Sarah's Key. It was about the roundup of Jews in Paris. Key, yeah. 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 Tatiana de Rosnay. Yeah. The movie is not as good as the book, but the movie does go to this one memorial in Paris, the Shoah Memorial. It's free, you go in, and they have these walls with the 77,000 names of all those shipped out of Drancy. And my friend Leo's name is there under Transport 42. Yes?
One line in this song that really hits me. You've got to be taught to hate all the people that erode hate.
Mm-hmm.
How do we break that chain as humanity? How do we break that? I mean, that's a strong, very strong element of hate.
Yeah. I had a student, he was in his 40s, and it was election time, and I'd get on my soapbox and say, register, vote. I said, I'd love to tell you how to vote, but I can't. But he said, he raised his hand, he said, I'm a Republican. I said, okay, why are you a Republican? He said, my parents are. I said, okay, why are you? And then he brought up abortion. And I said, what else is on their platform? And he said, I don't know. And so I listed the other things on their platform. That was when they had a platform. And he at the end of my list, he said, why am I a Republican? I said, I don't know. And he, he hadn't questioned it before that time. And at some point, let's hope people, I would tell them, I said, you have the values you were brought up on, the beliefs you were brought up on, look at them at some point and see if they're truly yours. If they are, great. If they aren't, well, maybe you need to tweak it.
And in the 1860s, we could have said the same thing about the Democrats.
Yeah. Well, the platform of the Democrats then is the platform of the of the Republicans.
And
Yeah.
parties change.
Yeah.
The party of slavery was the Democrats.
Yeah. But getting people to question what they've always been taught is a good thing, because then they can make them truly their own or change their minds. But it's getting people to think that's sometimes difficult.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.